Hi, I'm Mimi Chan. Welcome to Culture Chat. Thanks for joining the conversation. Nick Winkelman is the head of athletic performance and science for the Irish Rugby Football Union. As a performance coach, Nick has worked with many athletes across the NFL, MLB, NBA, national sports organizations, and military. As a teacher, I enjoyed discussing his new book, The Language of Coaching. You don't have to be a coach to benefit from learning how to communicate more effectively. We also chat about Irish pubs, his current reads, and his experience in the industry. I am loving these conversations and hope you are too. If you are, please help support this podcast by rating and sharing it. If you'd like to support with a donation, you can become a patron of the show at patreon.com or by visiting my website. For comments or suggestions, email me at mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or reach out on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan. Now, on with the show. Hello, Nick Winkelman. Thank you so much for joining me on Culture Chat today.
Yeah, Mimi, it's my pleasure.
Well, I have to admit, when I saw your schedule and your first time slot for me was 4 a.m., I thought, wow, he is a really early riser. He's one of those strength trainers who gets up and my husband's like, he's in Ireland. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So embarrassingly, I didn't know where you were. But of course, I've heard your name several times. My husband is a strength coach and we've had the pleasure of working with Mike Boyle. And yes. I've actually had a lot of guests on this show in particular that I saw at the beginning of your book. So I was pretty excited that's the case. And so of course, it's an honor to have you on as well.
Oh, well, likewise. And you know what? I wish I got up at 4 in the morning every day. I always see Jocko Willink,
right.
the co-author of Extreme Ownership, and his 4:32 a.m. in a dark room with a sweat pool under his watch just makes me properly feel bad on a daily basis. So, if I can hit 6 a.m., it's a good day.
Yeah, I've seen those. I've seen where he goes, yeah, I took it easy and I slept in today. It's 5:45 or something, something ridiculous. But yeah, I love that book as well. So being in Ireland, I have to just jump straight in because previous to quarantine and COVID, loved traveling. My husband and I are huge world travelers, and that is actually one country we have not been to yet. So what's it like there, especially now, but generally speaking, how is Ireland?
In terms of the present scenario, I got to give credit where credit is due, especially with seeing the early warning signs with Italy and Spain. Ireland got its act together really quickly. So I remember my wife and I, I think it was in March, we took our kids out of school about, funny enough, 72 hours before the formal recommendation to do that came in. So we've been on quarantine since the end of March. And as of Monday, it started to open up. So now we can go as far as 20 kilometers from our house or to the edge of our county, whichever is larger. That just gives you an indication of how small. Yes, exactly. Very specific, an indication of how small Ireland is, So, but by all accounts, it hasn't been that bad here. It is an island with a very small population, but considering the age of the population here, they took precautions. So no, it's been going very well. Albeit, I think everyone's ready to get back to some level of normality, whatever that is.
Right. The new normal, as we all have been saying.
Exactly.
And I know that you've had this amazing, long and still ongoing career in the coaching industry and fitness. And of course, we're going to get into this book here. But when you first started out, did you imagine that you would be moving your family to Ireland as, the head coach or, the lead of the rugby organization over there? I mean, did you imagine this? I mean, this seems so interesting.
No, Yeah, the short answer is no. It's absolutely surreal. And, for me, I've always been a big believer that unless you push yourself to get well outside of your comfort zone, you're never going to grow. And so, I grew up with a wonderful family. I love my mom and dad to death, but they didn't travel a lot. We didn't get out and about beyond Portland, Oregon, where we grew up. I mean, it was a big trip to go to Hawaii, and we only did that one time when I was a kid. So for me, it wasn't in my blood to seek out the rest of the world. And in fairness, I think that's the case with many Americans that I meet. They're happy enough, like, hey, why would we leave? It's so great here. But with my job that I had working for a company called Exos, the education department, just started to grow. And inevitably, there was interest from Germany and China and Australia to go run courses. And so because I led the education arm of that entity, I started to travel. And I'm like, wow, look at these cultures, these countries, these languages, this different way of thinking and speaking. And as you start to travel, you get the travel bug. And so for me, it was just a natural crossroads. I had been working there for 10 years, and the opportunity in Ireland presented itself. And so I said, yeah, let's go. Young family, and I knew we would grow as individuals from a personal side, but most certainly from a professional side. And it has not disappointed.
Excellent. How old are your kids?
So my daughter just turned 9, going on 19.
Yep.
All of a sudden, she's wearing her headphones more. Her clothes are fancier. It's just remarkable what 24 hours apparently can do. And then my boy turns 5 next month. But pleasant surprise, I walked into the kitchen today and they had done their best to clean the entire thing. So every so often, when you think your children are absolutely out to get you, they do that one random act of kindness. And you're like, okay, that's good enough for at least 18 months.
Yeah, well, they're smarter than we are in some ways, right? They're just reeling you in. They're giving you, just what you need, that little bit of sugar.
Yeah, 100%.
And so, were they super excited to be moving to Ireland? Did they understand what that was going to be like?
My boy was he was almost 6 months at the time, so obviously he had no say in the matter.
Right.
but my daughter, she was 4, and she thought the whole thing as an adventure was amazing. And so now that we've been here for as long as she had lived in Arizona, so she spent about half and half her life. She's like, okay, where are we going next?
Yeah.
And so already for her, she thinks that this is going to be part and parcel to her upbringing. Now, I know once she gets into, let's say, high school, she'll want to stabilize for those few years. But right now, she wants to get back to grandma and grandpa on both sides, to be honest. That's what she really wants.
Of course. Well, they're the ones that really treat the special treatment with spoiling the grandkids. So why not? But I just think it's remarkable. And I love when I hear people take the opportunities that are presented, because like you said, a lot of Americans don't necessarily get out to travel, and these opportunities are so rare. So in terms of coaching, like, you've obviously trained athletes from the NFL to rugby teams and in between, and now across cultures. What have you found in your experience is very universal amongst the athletes? And then what have you found that's been different in variance?
It's such an interesting question, and it was probably the one that I was most curious about when I moved over here. As I alluded to earlier, luckily I had done a lot of education in Ireland, in the UK, so I had a sense, at least from a coaching perspective, what I was getting myself into. On the player side, the similarities are, I think that are universal. Is just when you have individuals who play a sport professionally, and they use their physical body is their literally their means of income, the drive and the intent and the motivation to get better is through the roof. And I would say that's been universal across sports. What's interesting about rugby, Mimi, and I don't know how much you know about it, it's a very old sport. It's far older than American football in terms of how long it's been played. But it's only been professional since the mid-90s. And so there's still this celebrated history of the amateur nature of the sport, where you just play quite literally for the love of the game. And so don't get me wrong, the NFL guys I've worked with and the various other professional sports, they love their game as well. But there's still, let's say, this youthfulness about the love of the game over here, that you're working with someone who's 32, they're a professional athlete, but that even if they weren't being paid, Mimi, they'd still be playing this game.
Right.
And I can't necessarily say that would be true as universally in the NFL players as I observe here with rugby. So there's this extra little drive and motivation. At the same time, Rugby is an international sport. American football is not. Even though we talk about being a world championship, people over here laugh at that. Like, how can you be a world champion when you win a Super Bowl if it's not played all across the world? But in rugby, it is. And so there's this added level of not only playing professionally, but playing for your country. And what we talk about with, leaving the jersey better than when you came in it. And so these are pieces that all play into a unique nature that, I'll be honest, is different about rugby in Ireland specifically than what I had faced and observed. And the reality is the money, Mimi, is nowhere on the scale of where it is in the NFL. So again, you have to be playing this for the right reasons.
Yeah, it almost makes me feel a little bit about when I've talked to other people, that kind of difference between like a college athlete versus the pro athlete, like that little bit of hunger, that little bit of I'm still striving, or, the musician who's still trying to make it. And so I think there's a definitive thing that happens when you get paid a lot of money to do something versus, like you said, the love of the game. I think that's really interesting. And I know you've also worked a lot with peers and coaches across the board as well. Do you find that those styles change when you cross borders, but also within different sports?
Yeah, it's really interesting, in terms of the workplace generally, and then the workplace of sports specifically in Ireland, it's definitely different. And what I try to explain to people, it's not better or worse, it's just different. And you might try to color that, but you have to understand that you're coloring it with your bias from what you're used to and where you grew up. And so for me, I was quite clear that that was not going to be the approach I was going to take. And I wanted to, almost like from a mindful perspective, just observe my emotions and how I reacted to certain things. So I'll just highlight a few differences. One, the American culture generally is one of great enthusiasm and positivity. And sometimes it is blind enthusiasm and blind positivity, where, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fantastic. It's going great. It's like you would think that no one in the United States has ever had a bad day in their life when you talk to them. And so, and that's taken up another level, as you probably know, Mimi, in the fitness industry. And there's just this enthusiasm and energy about people. I think of walking into the conferences and everyone is just jacked to the nines. Whereas here, if someone's having a bad day, Mimi, and you say, how are you doing? Oh, horrible. More colorful language than that. And so what I like about that is there is a sincerity in the way people interact with you. And don't get me wrong, sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's not, but you have a little bit more of an immediate sense of how you stand with an individual just by their behavior, verbally and non-verbally. Whereas in the States, I think there's just such a natural desire to appeal and to connect. And maybe a little bit is that the what's in it for me, there might be something here, so let me put my best foot forward. So that's one of the primary differences. Another one that I notice all the time, in the States, I think we naturally expect a lot of feedback and a lot of positive feedback. So if we've given a great presentation, oh, that was amazing. You want everyone and their mother to be running up and telling you. Whereas here, if you've given a really good presentation, one person might come up to you and say, I learned something from that, or nice job, or they might, as they say, take it out of you. Oh, you didn't screw that one up. And so this desire, this need to be externally validated is not nearly as high in Ireland and in the UK in general. And again, I'm not saying that that's positive or negative. It just is. So for me, what it's done is I would like to think that I'm a humble person, but that humble pie has come another level than, let's say, I originally expected. And what it's done to me, it just allows me to be focused on being satisfied with my own work, being driven by my own practice, and not seeking out always external feedback, which also means when you do get it, it's more meaningful.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you explain that so very eloquently. Actually, I enjoyed listening. So thank you for sharing that. But it's funny because I analogize everything, and I talk to a lot of wonderful coaches. I'm so blessed to be able to have these conversations. But everything I analogize back to Kung Fu, and everything you just said really resonates because in our little Kung Fu world, it's very much like that. It's very much that was not horrible. Like I didn't get, oh, Mimi, you're so good to it. Because my father was my teacher, right? So he's the grandmaster of our style. And so the feedback, it wasn't reflexive. Like when people ask you, like you said here, parents are a little bit horrified as they kind of learn at our school, and the culture of it is very different. But of course, we're also coming from a Chinese Kung Fu background. So that in itself is a very different culture. And it kind of, I've noticed, because we are also an international system, we have schools all over the world, but I don't really notice a huge difference when we go to teach our style at the different schools, because a martial arts student is kind of trained in the same way. And so that's why I always find it interesting that athletes, there are like these nuances culturally. I mean, there's obviously a lot of similarities across the board, but everything you just said really resonated. I'm like, oh, it sounds like being in a Kung Fu class and with peers, right? And but I think I've also been blessed to grow up hearing brutal / direct honesty all the time. And I think there's, like you said, there's pros and cons. It's not like it's better or worse, but it is, it is refreshing, because that reflexive, like, how are you? And you just say good, or you say it's reflexive versus actually listening. And that is something that really kind of goes well into your book, which is listening and communicating and the language you use and everything. The reason I actually have you on the show today, of course, is because my husband has seen you at Perform Better, and you made such a huge impression on him. And I'm sure you've heard this before, that people you have no idea, or athletes or martial artists, all these variances, probably dance schools, things that you never thought you would be kind of making an impact on. Like, you've actually made a really huge impact into a lot of the language that we've used even in our schools, because he brings all that home. He's the strength coach side. He does Kung Fu as well and teaches with us. But it's been nice because there's been so many parallels between what we've done in traditional Kung Fu, which of course is like thousands of years old, with the breathing and all this stuff. And he brings like the science side and explains why we do it versus, well, we just do it like this because we've always known. And he's been able to help us kind of bridge that gap. And so when he came home from your Perform Better, he was like, you should have just seen this room of everyone learning to run. And within seconds, the entire dynamic of the room changed, not just, and these are all professional, like coaches and athletes. It's not like just random people, right? So he was so impressed. And when, we use analogies and everything in martial arts, like you've definitely infiltrated that with, squishing a bug on the floor versus pushing your heel into the ground, all these things. And so, so it's been wonderful that you put it all into book form now, so that you've given us homework basically. And so we thank you for that. But yeah, you really made quite a crossover. And I think those that see this and say, oh, it's called the language of coaching, I think it's also the language of communication, which is probably more important now than ever. So it's interesting how mainstream this has become. So in terms of two things, many questions for you, but one is, when you obviously been doing these Perform Better conferences, you've been speaking on this a long time, you've kind of developed this quote unquote formula, like you've developed this way of teaching and you've put it into words. But when did you decide you're going to do the book? And then how did you kind of come to realize like this was such an important thing that needed to be brought attention to for coaching?
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's funny when your husband, Oscar, when he emailed me, I thought back to a quote that I've heard Mike Boyle say a number of times. And I know Mike's been one of your guests, and that is, you never know who's in front of you. And what he meant by that is just, one, you don't know the impact you might have and the echo of your impact through their life. But equally, if it's an echo, it comes back, and you never know how that person might assist you or support you in the future. And so I think this is a perfect example of that. So thank you. It's humbling. But when we look at the book itself, maybe I can start with a little bit of an example just to piggyback on your Kung Fu, experience, and probably notably those who are listening. And it doesn't matter if it's Kung Fu, it could be any sport, but we probably all had that experience. And you can come at this from both the side of the coach or the side of the person being coached, so the athlete. And you're in on a Monday and you make these grand improvements. And so from the coaching perspective, maybe you're cueing and you're seeing these improvements and high fives all around, happy days. And on the athlete side, okay, you feel like you're starting to get something. And this is that sense of, okay, things are starting to click. And on the back of that, we have two different outcomes that I think people will be familiar with. One is you come back for your next session, let's say it's a week later, and that click is still there. You know, that the seatbelt is still on, the light bulb is still on, whatever phrase you want to use. But I would say we've all had the same experience whereby we come back the next Monday and it's like it's gone. The light is off. The click has now been unclicked and the improvement has dissolved. And you feel almost this defeated. It's like one step forward, one step back. And coaches will pull their hair out on this because they're like, we had to change. What happened? Where did it go? And I think everybody in the movement profession deals with that. And it's so, it's so interesting and it's confusing. It's like, well, where the heck did the improvement go? We had this change. I observed it, but now it's gone. And so for me, that probably was the core thing, the seed, if you would, that started my path down asking that question, saying what goes into that. And while maybe there are many things that go into it, one of the most profound and one of the most important is the communication between the coach and the athlete. Because if we think about it, oftentimes in those moments where there's the light bulb, it usually, not always, let me be clear, but usually comes off the back of some kind of a discussion. And you come up with a new cue or a new idea, or you're given all these ideas. And so ultimately, it's out of that language blossoms a change. But some of those changes seem to stick and keep going, and others don't. And so when you start to get into that and you start studying then language and how language impacts movement, things start to reveal themselves that, okay, hold on. Certain kinds of language can work right now if the coach is reminding the athlete of them all the time, almost like the coach is an extension of their memory, literally in their ear. But then there are these other types of language, which most certainly we can get into, that seem to be stickier, seem to travel better in the mind of the athlete, and seem for whatever reason to be easier to own by the athlete. And once we, not that there's some big reveal, but there's a little bit of that at play here. Once you understand the difference between the language that sticks and the language that supports learning and the language that works in the short term, or in fact, in many cases, can actually degrade movement, then all of a sudden, once you know it, it's like, that is so obvious. I actually knew this, but I'd never given it thought. And that's, for me, one of the major motivations behind then writing the book. It's like, okay, it's cool that I observed that this was a problem, and it's cool that I found this solution embedded in communication. But then as I started to look around, I'm like, nobody's talking about this. You go to strength conditioning conferences or any kind of related conference, and you're seeing things about corrective exercise and program design and how to put more lean mass on and how to lose more body fat. But nobody outside of a handful of people are talking about coaching. And even when you go to a presentation like The Art of Coaching, which I've given those, very often it gets into motivation and client retention and social media. And again, please believe, I'm not saying that's a negative in any cases. But for me, it was a failure of omission. It's like we forgot this really core ingredient in this thing that we were trying to build. And even though people communicate all the time, and it's the primary means that we use to make a change, I would say, day to day, why isn't anyone talking about it? And so that led me inevitably to let's say, study it as vigorously as I applied it. And I decided to get a PhD on the topic. One, I knew it would give my wife, and it did, a very large headache. So anyone who writes a book and gets a PhD, if they're married, does not do it alone. So she's the absolute champion behind the scenes, so to speak. But I got the PhD not because I wanted to be an academic, but because I wanted to make sure I had the credibility and the rigor on the science, so to speak, of communication and movement, as I did on the application. And so ultimately we get to 2016, to make a very long story a little bit longer, and the book still had not been written. And I'm like, okay, you know what? I've put in my time over a decade of thinking and applying, making mistakes, and I want to put this book out. I want to put the book out that I was looking for when I started over 10 years ago, and I want to make sure that the next generation of coaches and the existing coaches can get to where I am, if where I am is in a better place quicker than I did.
Hmm. Yeah. And one of the things, and I'm going to fully admit, I haven't finished it. I'm going to,
No worries.
it's not one of those books you could just like read, after page one, I'm taking notes. I was like, oh man, I feel like I'm in school again, but it's good school because it's stuff that's going to benefit exactly what I'm doing. But yeah, it's a very, each page is jam packed. It's very dense. So it's
Yes.
so much information. So yes, I am not all the way through it yet. And I know my husband's in, I think, your book club or something. So I'm going to get what I call the Oscar notes as well. So, but
Yes.
what I did gather, and from all of the things that I've seen from your posts and all of the information that Oscar brings back to me, is that I love your emphasis as well on not just the communication part, but the importance of connecting with people and building a relationship in order to become a better communicator and teacher. And, my example, like I said, I love this kind of bridging the gap because I've been fortunate to be thrown into the world of Kung Fu since I was able to walk. And then I was immediately thrown into teaching. And that's been a learning process that I had to kind of do on my own. No one taught me how to teach. And so much trial and error. But, for example, and Oscar's like, oh yeah, you should share this example because it will resonate. But we have a lot of special needs kids and adults at our school. And sometimes, they're much more challenging because you can't always use just language and whatnot. And so you have to figure out a way. And we had this one child, and she's a child with autism, and she just shut down. She's like, nope, not doing it. And all the instructors, and I have a lot of high school and college level age instructors that kind of help out with the kids. And she was just shut down. And I went over to her and I was just like, what would Batman do? And my instructors are like, what the heck are you talking about? I'm like, you guys, didn't you see her water bottle? It's got Batman on it. Like you have to remember, and I didn't have to have a 5-minute conversation with her. Like, so what's your favorite show? Who's your favorite, whatever, but you have to kind of be observant and like make those little connections. And I think when I was reading some of the things that you had in there, that just came to my mind because I feel like those are, like you said, the missing things that you want to remind coaches about that isn't about the muscles and the, here's the anatomy and the science part. Like it's kind of, I think, missing. But so I love your emphasis on that there's like a building of a relationship and a connection, even in addition to the actual language that's used.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mimi. And I think I'll share a very similar example here in a moment. But, when people say, what's the book about? And that's like the toughest question to answer as an author. You're like, well, I just spent a decade trying to write it. You want me to answer that in one sentence? But for me, it does come down to, what's the book about? Simply put, how do coaches, and insert coach for parent, sport coach, physio, doesn't matter, but how do coaches connect to the athlete through their language, and in doing so, help the athlete connect better to their movement? That's really what it's about. It's the bridge between me and you, and the bridge that creates between you and your movement. And since you do Kung Fu and you coach Kung Fu, Kung Fu for many individuals, I would imagine who are in there, it's about the movement, but it's also about what the movement means. It's a higher purpose.
Absolutely.
It's, I'm learning self-discipline, I'm learning control, I'm mastering my body. So there's all these whys behind the what. And so even though my book is about movement, you're right. But the way I look at it is we are coaching people through movement. We're not just teaching them movement. Movement is a means to teach them something else. And so I think to do that effectively, connection and bridge is so important. So funny enough, you talk about Batman, my story is about Superman. And so I was working with a client. I had just, passed personal training school. I was in college making a little bit of extra money, and I was working with him one-on-one. And of course, you sit down and you do the intake. And so I'm finding what's your goals and whatnot. And when he starts to talk about his goals, he says, listen, What you have to understand about me is I'm separated from my wife, and we have a 5-year-old son, and he lives with her. And he has a poster of Superman on his wall. And he idolizes Superman. And for me, the reason I'm here is I want to be my son's Superman. And as he shared this, frankly, I was probably too young to appreciate the full gravity, but there was pain behind that comment. And Superman was nothing more for this person than a metaphor for doing whatever he can to be, in his son's eyes, Superman. And so this was one of the ingredients, getting his body physically in shape. And so a few sessions in, we're working on an RDL, a single leg RDL. And, he's struggling to keep his body straight. His back is flexed. He's losing balance. Common problems for everyone when they first try to do that single leg hinging movement. And like you, it wasn't like I had been interrogating him for information. I just, in that moment, what he was struggling with, there was a connection between the body position of Superman flying off the roof to get Lois Lane or whoever is falling that day, and this movement pattern. And so I just looked at him. I said, listen, as you go down to that bottom position, I just want you to get long like Superman flying off the building to get Lois Lane. And you could kind of almost see this intensity in his eyes, as they almost dilated as I was saying it. And he grabs the dumbbells and he gets in and he goes for his set of whatever it is, 10 on each side. And he stands up with tears welling up in his eyes and he just says, thank you. And I've never forgotten that. And probably even as I wrote the book, that was a central theme in my mind that, even though we're using cues to improve movement, the language itself, the more it connects with them and their experiences in life and what's important to them, not only does it make it easier to teach the movement, but by the very nature of using that cue in that moment, I say to him, I see you, I hear you, and this movement is important to achieve an outcome. So we're going to use that outcome to help you improve this movement. And in this case, it was the analogy of Superman. And so let's be honest. I'm not saying every single movement needs to become this soap opera, Ellen DeGeneres moment where people are crying. But I think in both of our stories, it illustrates the higher purpose that if you are an active listener, if you take an inventory of all the things that your clients say and mark as important to them, therein lies, as I articulate in the book, their language locker. And I need to coach from their language locker, not mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, for our listeners who are like, well, you guys already know what you're doing. There's like been 10 times as many failures in coaching as there has been successes. And that's what we kind of build on and learn on. So, I know that both of us, we really do come from a place of like putting in the time. And one of the things that we do that I have a hard time with students and training them is they can do the movement, but they don't do it with the intent and the purpose. And I've noticed that you say a lot, I've seen on your posts, like attention into intention. And I really liked that because I thought that kind of resonated with me and I'm learning from that as well. And so in your book, you also mentioned the Malcolm Gladwell thing with the 10,000 intentional hours, and that's been a thing. And what's interesting is, so, from the dawn of time, in our books, we have this thing in Chinese martial arts where we have all these weaponry and they have these symbolic meanings and these animals that go with it and whatnot. And the one that's the hardest is the double-edged sword. It's like the mother of all weapons. And it is always said it takes 10,000 days to master. So, 30, 40, 50 years later, when Malcolm Gladwell's book comes out, I'm going, that's an interesting number. And the thing is, in Chinese martial arts, it's not like, just because you do it, you're going to be there. It has to be very intentional. It's just understood. But then you kind of wrote it out. And there's been other podcasts and things I've listened to that kind of explain, okay, it's not just this magic number. I mean, so can you maybe talk a little bit to the purposeful hours or the purposeful work and that intentional work? I'd like to kind of hear you expand on that.
Yeah, for sure. And so I'll give a little bit of a story/thought experiment before I get into the 10,000 hours and call it intentional practice. And so when I'm at conference, to illustrate this idea of attention being important, I'll always say, okay, raise your hand if you've been on more than 100 flights. And a lot of people raise their hand. Okay, raise your hand if you've been on more than 500. Quite a few hands go down. And then, okay, raise your hand if you've been on over 1,000 flights. And usually you have maybe one or two. And the unsuspecting victim stands up. You say, okay, you've been on over 1,000 flights. I want you to go ahead. They think they're at a magic show at this point, right? They're all nervous. I want you to go ahead and recite the safety briefing verbatim to the entire crowd. And immediately, the odd funny person will try to crack a joke, but usually you just have them stunned like, is this guy serious? And they'll say, okay, that'll do. Sit down. And everyone cheers for him. I said, the point of this is simple. And that is, just because you are around something, just because you are in proximity to something, does not mean that you will learn it, does not mean that you will learn from it. How many coaches have felt that they were coaching, right, within an inch of their life, every moment of a session, and they have some people that their trajectory just continues to rise as if they're absorbing it all. And then they have the other athletes that feel like they come in and just turn their ears off the second they walk in the door. And so this is intuitive to us. We know that you have to be more than physically present. You have to be cognitively, mentally present. And so that illustrates, if you would, that attention and intention means you take your attention and you put it towards a specific goal. That's what intention is. That intention is critical. And what I intend to do is what the brain prioritizes. Okay, everybody, new information coming in. Because the reality is it is impossible, literally impossible, to attend to and gain information from everything in your circumstance. Again, let me illustrate this. If you're listening intently right now, you probably have not been aware of the clothes on your body. If you're sitting down, you probably haven't been thinking around the way the seat feels from a pressure on your hips or your low back. If you're wearing a watch, you probably haven't noticed how it feels on your skin. But I guarantee, as I just walked you through from clothes to chair to watch, in your mind, and you probably thought you controlled it, but you didn't, your attention quickly scanned and you felt the clothes, you felt the chair, and you felt the watch. And what that seeks to illustrate is, prior to me making mention to that, unless you had an itch or something, you were fundamentally blind, what we say attentionally blind, to those other sources of information. And so what this then gets down to is, yes, it's not just about 10,000 hours of practice. I mean, Malcolm Gladwell has been browbeaten on that now for a long time. And so I think that the record has been set straight that people can earn quote unquote expertise, which is, by itself is difficult to define, but most certainly sooner than 10,000 hours. And for certain tasks and for certain people, it takes more. But what seems to be the commonality is the quality, the intensity, or the intentionality of that practice. And what we're getting at for those who say, ooh, I like this topic, I want to learn more. Well, the book Peak by Anders Ericsson, which came out a few years back, that is the key book if you want to get the story from the source, because it's his 1990s paper that spurred on all the discussion around expertise and timelines. And so in his book, which I profile, and Mimi, I don't know if you've gotten there yet, but I profile his book extensively at the beginning of chapter 2 on attention in my own book. There are all these features of how, if you would, to ramp up the intentionality or the purpose of your practice. But the key takeaway here is that is everything I'm doing with purpose, with intention, and with intensity behind that intention. And that is key. And we can start to unpack this concept insofar as language by its very nature is our primary mechanism to take this mental spotlight and point it at the right things. And fundamentally, the things I'm trying to point your attention at, put simply, are the things I want you to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a couple other things I wanted to go over before I go into what I call my fun stuff. But because one of the things that you have to do and something that I have had to do. So basically, when I do this podcast, pretty much selfishly, I just ask all the things that benefit me. So listeners, I hope you benefit as well, but this is really for me now. But we also have to coach new coaches. And what I've found for Kung Fu specifically, there's no choice. You have to reach a certain level of expertise. There's this long learning curve. But Oscar, for his strength, the gym, he's found that he almost would rather have somebody who's just got the personality and is really kind, is outgoing, is very well spoken, but doesn't actually have, fitness experience, because it's easier to kind of mold them versus sometimes when you get someone that's too seasoned and they just want to basically tell you I think you referenced it, that golf swing thing, here's every little detail about all the muscles that's used during a squat versus, just sit back on the chair, right? Like it's interesting. Like, have you found that as well? I mean, it's kind of hard, I think, at your level of expertise where you can just bring in amateurs, quote unquote, and just train them. But do you find it's easier to train people that maybe don't have as much knowledge? Because sometimes it's just harder to break habits, and then or which do you find? Because I know you've had to train coaches and assistants and everything.
I mean, I'll put a question to you, and then I'll bounce off it. But Mimi, have you ever had a Kung Fu athlete of sorts come from a different training center?
Yes.
And they come to you guys, and you have to, so to speak, help them unlearn certain bad habits. Have you ever had that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And I think every coach has dealt with that as well. And so if we flip that, that's exactly what we're talking about. And that is, nowadays, information is so plentiful. We have these quote unquote coaches come in, but they're almost theorists in that they know so much detail about what they are going to coach and what they are going to program, but their experience in actually converting that into language, into a phrase that the athlete in front of them can understand, is minute in comparison. And so it's not so much that we're trying to get them to unlearn the theory, but realize, hey, if you're selling a computer, you need the person who can build the computer and then the person who can sell the computer. The person that builds the computer knows about the processor, the detail, the chips, everything inside of it. The person that sells it needs to explain to Grandma Jenny how to simply use it, how to turn it on. And so you still need the person that made the computer. You still need all the detail, otherwise the computer wouldn't exist. Otherwise the drill and the technique wouldn't exist. But then you need to be able to step into that simple mindset in converting and communicating at their level. And so oftentimes it's not so much the unlearning, but being able to hide what you know inside of simple phrases that put a picture in the mind of the person that make it accessible. And I kind of call this the Trojan horse effect. How can you hide all of your technical language inside of something visual, fluffy, nice to think about, that's easy to remember, and, oh, by the way, gets them to use the computer effectively, gets them to move effectively. And to be honest, that is a challenge that every coach faces. Again, why? Because we forgot to tell them that their biomechanics textbook and their kinesiology textbook and their programming manuals were not synonymous with the words, language, and phrases you use to teach that stuff. And so that's the gap I'm hoping the language of coaching can fill.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very obvious and apparent as well in the way that the book's laid out. So because at the beginning, you're getting kind of that technical background, you're getting like the meat, and then you're like, oh, but I want to flip to the back to where just give me the answers, give me the cues. But it is important as well, especially at the level of coaching that you're doing. But I think those that really want to go deeper, so that's something in Kung Fu we talk about, is kind of having that deeper knowledge versus just taking someone and quote unquote saying, all right, just tell them this. But it is important that they have that background and that knowledge and understanding. So you kind of have the beginning as the foundation, as the basics. Learn this, understand it, and then apply it, which is different than what you know in your head. And it is a hard thing to do, which is why I think this book is excellent. And especially for those coaches that have so much experience and they think, well, I'm already a coach. I already know how to coach, right? I think this is even more important for that level of coaching, because I think it does bridge that gap nicely.
And see, maybe if I can say something about that, because my publisher and I, we went over this again and again and again in the part one of the book, which talks about learning, memory, and attention. Those, if you would, are they're bedrock principles. I mean, they are like salt, flour, water, and egg. I mean, they are core ingredients to make many, many things. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you're finding that while I don't shy away from authentic terminology, is the way I put it, and the science, as best we can, we tried to write it in a way that told stories of the science and put it in visuals. And so I explain it as, we take you deep enough, and right when you think like you need to go up for air, the book takes you up for air and gives you a story, gives you an anecdote, an analogy to help you get through it. But to your point, if it's an experienced coach, yeah, I suggest to them, read it from cover to cover. You'll have no issues at all. But for many individuals, if you start with just part two, you're going to be completely fine. It's almost like an anthology. You can start there in the middle. And what I tell people is, if you're in the middle and you're learning the fun stuff, you're learning the strategies, and even if you don't know the science, you're still going to be able to apply what's in there. But if something strikes you as, wow, I'm really interested in this, I want to know more, well, guess what? Just pop back to part one. And you're right, Mimi, even if you just go to the back of the book and just literally steal, which I encourage everyone to do, all the strategies, you're still better for it. And so whether you start part 1, 2, or 3, we've designed it in that way. You can't go wrong.
My OCD would not allow me to do that.
Yeah, mine wouldn't either. So
never going to happen. I'm so going in order.
It gets just like this podcast. It gets to the fun stuff here soon enough.
Yeah, no, I'm so going in order. No, this has all been the fun stuff. Trust me. I mean, it's been a great conversation. So when I say fun stuff, it's because I want to know, like, tell me about the food in Ireland, because I care about food and things like that. And I always just find that it's an interesting thing to also kind of learn, like, what your environment's like and whatnot. So yeah, speaking of food, because that's a big deal to me, tell me about the food in Ireland. Has that been different or better, worse?
Well, yeah, in this case, it's been different. It's been different. And I would say it's not as diverse. Okay. Most certainly you can go downtown Dublin and you can find a diversity of restaurants, but it's not New York. Okay. You're not going to find 20 different versions of the exact same very specific type of Lebanese food in one area. And so it is diverse. I would say they tend to overcook things. Okay. I think there's this concern. I'm being serious. If you want to get meat, they tend to overcook it. And I've had even people over from a barbecue perspective. So I'm barbecuing, and I've had them say, hey, do you mind throwing the meat back on?
Really?
I'm like,
they want to make sure it's all killed.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, do you want this to taste like the belt you're wearing? Okay, so here we go. And so that's been one thing. I mean, they do the pub food. They knock the pub food out. So if it's fried,
right, which you really can't eat daily. I mean,
well, you can't, and the scale continues to remind me of that, Mimi, that you can't eat it daily. And so my willpower has been tested moving here. But on the positive, the beer and just, let's say, the nightlife culture, the pub is the third place. We have Starbucks, United States. Here we have the pub, and it's the restaurant, it's the pub, it's the meeting place. Families can go there usually and eat till 9, and then after 9, it becomes more what we traditionally call a bar. But funny enough, when people say, what are you going to miss more than anything else? I'll miss many things, but at the top of the list are the pubs. They're amazing.
Fair enough. No, they always portray them in movies as such jovial places. And like you said, after hours, though, it gets a little bit dicey. It can be a little not for kids. But yeah, they always portray it as being this very jovial, family place. So.
They live up to it.
Okay. And so I totally stole this question from another amazing podcaster, and I love to ask it, especially to you fitness professionals, because you speak so often and you're always asked to speak on the same realm of subjects. So if you were going to a conference and you were to speak on a subject that's completely not fitness related, that people would be surprised you have an expertise in, what would that subject be?
Probably of most recent, it would be on DJing.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, see, so that's when I started traveling to Germany. And funny enough, I was on a webinar with a bunch of people from the original city I went in Germany. So when I mentioned this club that was my spark for DJ, and they all were like cheering because they all knew about it. But when I went to Germany for the first time to do some coach education, I knew about electronic music and house music, but not like they know
in
about
Germany.
it
Yeah,
in Germany.
It's no joke.
And so when I started going to Germany and Amsterdam and doing these education courses, I just fell in love with house music. And I've always had kind of a musical tilt. And so I don't know when it was, might have been 2013. I just bought a little DJ set, and it's just grown year on year. And so I love to talk to people about how learning to DJ is a lot like learning, and this is nerdy, for program design. But how with music and how you connect with people and how different songs work together, there's a lot of parallels there. And so, if I was to do a master class, it might be on learning to DJ and how to DJ.
I love it. And what do you use for your software, or what's your DJ, like what's your platform?
Well, yeah. So my DJ software is called Serato. And so that's the DJ software all the music goes into. And then I use all the Pioneer. So if you imagine that the big DJs with the arms in the air and the picture of kind of their DJ setup that looks like a foreign language to most people, that's the one I have downstairs. And so I've treated myself with far more expensive equipment than I've earned, but it's my reprieve.
I feel like it's earned. I feel like it's earned. Anyone that could put together a book like this I know I've never written a book. I've made a documentary, and that was also like a 10+ year. I have empathy for you in a different way. Like I get it. And you totally deserve to have your reprieve, like you said. So that sounds really cool. So you said you've always had a love for music. Did you play an instrument growing up, or were you in any sort of band or anything?
No, nothing. My mom always hates the story. I always say, at school, when you're in elementary school, they bring in a few instruments, and like that's your first time to say you might want to play one. And I think my memory is correct. I wanted to play the trumpet, but Mom and Dad didn't let me. I don't know what it is.
It's too loud.
Exactly. So no, but I remember my very first Boys II Men CD and my boombox. Oh my goodness, Mariah Carey. I've always loved music.
It's Motown Philly, right?
Yes, back again. So 100%.
I saw them in middle
Did
school
you?
Because in the States they had these they called them stay in school jams. So they had a bunch of artists and musicians that went around to middle schools, because I think at the time there was this huge dropout rate, and they were promoting, and there was like basketball players, and they were promoting, stay in school, and they came and they did a thing, and so I was really excited. I got to see that, so that was cool. So, do you guys train with music on when you do like your coaching and stuff like that? Are you really like a stickler for the playlist then, since you're big on music?
Well, no, so since my role kind of works across a number of different professional and national teams, I'm not usually the one doing the DJing.
Right.
Albeit during this COVID scenario, I've been doing Instagram live DJ sets from the living room. I think I've done like 10 of them now, so I might be getting some requests. Who knows? But usually it's the athletes. And the problem is, the athletes are always split into thirds. It's like you have the ones that like the hip hop, the ones that kind of have the rock tilt, and then those in this part of the world that like the house music. So you never can appeal to everybody.
Oh yeah, no, that's something that we learned a long time ago. We used to take requests in okay, well, what do you guys want to listen to? But nobody can agree, and he does small group training, so it's like 4 people, and it's still a disaster. So for sure. I know we got to wrap up here. So just the last couple questions, like reading and researching and all the work that went into this. Obviously it was a lot. But I know that you're a big reader, but do you also get to read for fun? Do you like fiction? What kind of reads do you enjoy, or what do you enjoy other than the DJing, I guess, too?
No, reading's a huge one for me. The book I'm reading right now, it's nonfiction, is called Cure, Mind Over Body. And this is actually a whole book on the impact of the placebo effect. And so again, most of the nonfiction I read has to do with mind, body, and those kind of pieces. So that's part. But I do get into fiction every so often. My wife is just the prequel to the Hunger Games that just came out. And so once she's done with that, I will be reading that about how President Snow came into being. So I do like the odd fiction. I have all the Game of Thrones books.
Okay.
That I've already seen the series, which is kind of unfortunate, but I'll get through those at some point as well.
Wow, those are a commitment. Because
they are a commitment.
Pretty healthy sized books.
Yeah. I might edit my memory in 12 years and say, oh yeah, they were great books. So.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's been an extraordinary pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for sharing with me today and laughing and also educating me. It's definitely been a learning podcast, so I always appreciate that. And hopefully you'll come back again and be a guest.
Oh, thank you so much, Mimi. It was a pleasure.
And before we end, can you let everyone know where they can get the language of coaching and a little bit more about it? I mean, about where they can get the book. Not more about the book, obviously.
Yes.
But
Yes. Okay, we have another hour? No.
Yeah.
The language of coaching, the art and science of teaching movement is on all the Amazon sites. But if you find yourself on Human Kinetics website, that's the publisher. You can get it there as well. If you want to kind of stay up to date, I'm doing a lot of call it webinars, and 99% of it's all free outside of the book, thelanguageofcoaching.com. And as people get questions, I do answer this email, info@thelanguageofcoaching.com. And like you noted, Mimi, when you write a book, it's always outdated by the time it's been published. Fortunately, this is not true of my book, but to try to keep the stream of consciousness fresh, I'm on @NickWinkelman at Twitter and Instagram.
Absolutely. So, and I will link that all here for you listeners. Beautiful. So that you can just click and go, and hopefully you will pick it up and also review it if you do pick it up and enjoy it.
Yes, please.
I understand what that's like as a podcaster. Like, please review and share with others. So again, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll talk again soon, I hope.
Yeah, thank you.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat, and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com, or follow me on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.